Okay, so thank you everyone for coming today. As I mentioned before, we have today Dr. Petra Creamer from Emory University, who will be talking to us about the collapse of the Assyrian Empire from city to countryside. So I'll hand it over to you, Petra.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I want to thank ARWA for, providing this platform that is incredibly useful to scholars, to public interest, and to, of course, our collaborators in the Middle East and other areas. And I especially want to thank Steve and Andre for inviting me to give this talk. It's given me kind of an opportunity to start really diving into the meat of something that is kind of a new avenue of research for me. So I'm really interested to see where this develops and to see what you guys think of it. But this is mostly related to the current fieldwork with rural landscapes of Iron Age imperial Mesopotamia, and the post-Assyrian material that we are starting to find there. So I'm really inspired by the fact that the resilience of power structures has always managed to form a kind of dynamic backdrop to the study of empires. And the Neo-Assyrian and the Neo-Babylonian empires of the first millennium BCE are really no exception. So let's make sure this works. Nice. These structures in the transition between the two empires, however, are pretty elusive, though much ink has really been spilled about the Assyrian imperial collapse between roughly 612 and 609 BCE. In recent decades, the conversation on such collapse events has tended to shift away from narratives of huge breaks in culture, in economy, and in lifeways to focus instead upon the resilience of local communities. The inherent joining of collapse with specifically studies of imperial systems began really in force throughout archaeological research with the advent of Yaffe and Cowgill's edited volume in the 80s, The Collapse of Ancient States and Civilizations, along with Tainter's monograph from the same year, The Collapse of Complex Societies. Both bodies of work really not only investigated the causes of social political collapse on one end, but also argued for the intellectual benefit of, and I quote from Fowler here, inquiry into periods when the legitimacy of leaders eroded, when economics faltered, and when political fragmentation created not only new crises, but also new opportunities for reimagining society. End quote. Thus, in the last 4 decades, building upon the preoccupations of like the last centuries of scholarship, probably best exemplified in Gibbon's famous The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, approaches to collapse in these pre-modern societies have been particularly concerned with the arrival at collapse itself and the events or circumstances that precipitated that arrival at collapse. The priority, therefore, has ended up laying on nuancing the effects of collapse on societal cessation and continuity, and how that appears in the material record as a proxy of lived change. Yet, in the last 2 decades or so, the focus has really shifted to accommodate questions on the long-term survival of such collapse events, or rather, through such collapse events. In effect, how collapse of certain socio-political or state entities manifested within and then affected such existing systems. To that end, a new focus on resilience has taken center stage. Resilience in the historical and archaeological discussion of past societies really has a lot of varying definitions. In this sense, it's usually employed to describe the continuation or adjustment of political, economic, and social practices, with an emphasis on the survival of either one or really all of these. The priority of human biological survival is, of course, implied in most of this. With a recent new emphasis on environmental studies, especially within archaeological approaches to the past, in some studies, resilience has taken on a particular meaning that surrounds the adjustment in these lifeways to survive within a shifting climate also, whether that means emphasizing certain sources of food over others, or adopting more transient forms of life, such as nomadism or semi-nomadism. In other cases, the emphasis is really placed on full recovery of long-distance trade, of political systems, or of industry, just to name a few. So among these, of course, is an intellectual concern with the impact of changes caused by the dissolution of specifically political entities, including any infrastructural and administration changes maintained at state or supra-community levels. So attention now is especially paid to agentive responses to upheaval studied at various levels of society. The recognition of resilience as purposeful, not passive, is critical to us now as we really start tackling these ideas of post-collapse. So accurately, it has been identified that even in the face of political upheaval, the effects on the broader populace outside of the government and elite institutions are likely, though not always, less dramatic. This has been suspected to be the case for many regions in the Near East following the collapse of the Assyrian Empire, though archaeologists and historians alike struggle with very little evidence to prove this assumption, of which I will be discussing may or may not be true. When focusing on the centers of imperial governance specifically, such as Nineveh, Nimrud, and Ashur, to name a few, it's really perhaps unsurprising that the focus of transition in northern Mesopotamia between the Neo-Assyrian and the Neo-Babylonian rulership, and then Achaemenid control shortly following, tends to prioritize violence and upheaval of imperial collapse, which is not particularly surprising considering these cities were all violently sacked, and that's what brought an end to the Assyrian Empire. However, we have also noticed that at more far-flung centers, such as Dur Katlimu or modern Tel Sheikh Hamad in the Khabur region of northeastern Syria, really are more subject to a narrative of continuing social and political systems, some which persist even decades after the Assyrian collapse event. So while dramatic collapse events and the persistence of institutions and communities after are not necessarily mutually exclusive, it's still difficult to reconstruct the lasting impact of the collapse of the Assyrian Empire itself, though that's indeed what I'm trying to do here today. The once heartland of Assyria, which spans a loose triangle between Ashur, Nineveh, and Erbil that you can see here, is really subject to a notorious blind spot in this regard, despite being the core of the Assyrian Empire itself. While excavations of the late 20th and the current century no longer prioritize Neo-Assyrian material to the detriment of all superseding periods, at least not explicitly, material from the post-Assyrian period between roughly 612 and 539 BCE is pretty notorious for being ephemeral and difficult to recognize, mostly due to a continuation of ceramic culture that persists even through the Achaemenid period directly following both of these. Additionally, nearly no documentary evidence survives in the Heartland from this period, creating in effect a mini Dark Age. Furthermore, often left out of these narratives is the effects of collapse on the rural sphere, with the consequence that urban-oriented approaches to the study of collapse have provided really an incomplete understanding of the processes borne out by a majority of society living outside of the major centers, which are so often focused upon. Meaning, in essence, that we have ignored what could be a very useful body of evidence to assess the continuity of various systems through collapse. While urban centers in the Assyrian Heartland were certainly critical loci for military and political turbulence, nobody's arguing that, might Assyrian institutions and their various systems of administration have survived into the Neo-Babylonian hegemony outside of these main centers? It's probably the rural sphere that we need to look at for that. So in this talk today, I'm essentially asking, what did this post-Assyrian period look like beyond the main centers? The purpose of this question is twofold, of course. So the purpose of this is twofold. First, to really seek evidence of institutional continuity within the Assyrian Heartland, but outside of these often talked about capitals, where institutions, in the case that I'm talking about today, mean political bodies of governing and administration, or possibly religious institutions intertwined with governing bodies and economic systems. And the second part then is to reconcile what little we do know historically and archaeologically of the Assyrian Heartland in the post-Assyrian period with evidence for institutional resilience elsewhere at this time, most notably in northern Syria, like I talked about. Before we really start in on this, however, let's set up parameters on how to actually identify possible instances of institutional resilience in this case. I have up here the basics, but functionally it's the continued use, including repair and reconstruction of administrative or public buildings such as temples, palaces, or large storage centers. Secondly is like evidence, archaeological or historical, of course, of administration continuing to function at the site. For example, continuation of taxation systems or held offices or names of such held offices. And third is a continued production of material for supra-community consumption. So not at the domestic or otherwise small scale level, but providing for people beyond just that single site. So with this setup, we should probably first discuss the institutions that actually existed during the Neo-Assyrian period. With the onset of imperial control systems in the first millennium BCE, the Assyrian Heartland's characters notably changed, along with that of the surrounding areas. Reforms implemented by Tiglath-Pileser III in the 8th century and then continued under the Sargonids changed the face of Assyrian administration and military strategy, which vastly expanded imperial territory, while massive infrastructural projects and mass movements of conquered persons to the imperial core functionally altered the living landscape. Within the Heartland and elsewhere in Mesopotamia proper, however, new canal systems were constructed and new villages were settled in agriculturally marginal areas. Meanwhile, the mega cities that we've already talked about grew even further, with the latest capital of the Assyrian Empire, Nineveh, estimated by some to be the largest city in the world at that time. However, the densely populated landscape of the imperial Heartland appears to really have been short-lived. Preliminary data from surveys in the area, such as the Erbil Plain Archaeological Survey in Iraqi Kurdistan and neighboring survey projects such as the Land of Nineveh Archaeological Project and the Upper Greater Zab Archaeological Reconnaissance, indicate a steep decline in post-Assyrian occupation and post-Assyrian settlement organization compared to that of the preceding Neo-Assyrian period, which saw just this burst in village number. Though, of course, the results of such survey collections within Mesopotamia especially should be taken with a grain of salt regarding the post-Assyrian and Achaemenid periods, both due to similarity in ceramic forms, like I've already talked about. So corroborating the possibility of deurbanization post-collapse, however, are accounts written by those traversing the post-Assyrian Heartland, still few in number, I'll be the first to admit, but it's some of our best evidence so far, our best historical evidence so far. So most of our information on the lasting effects of Assyrian collapse outside of these urban contexts really comes to us from historical sources like Xenophon's Anabasis, where he describes the area observed by the Greek mercenaries on their march between the Upper and Lower Zab in the late 5th century BCE is dotted with villages, and relatively productive villages at that, but without much beyond a sparsely populated Nineveh as cities. Further written sources recording settlements in the Heartland are really few and far between, like I said, but the other notable source also describing traveling through the old core of the empire is that of a letter sent by the satrap of Egypt under the Achaemenids, the named Arsames, ordering provisions for the journey of his estate member Nachlor. So Arsames addresses the officials of several cities in this area who should provide for Nachthor in and outside the Heartland on his travels, including those of Lair, Arzuhin, Arbel, modern-day Erbil, and Hul, possibly Halzu, along with others. So thus, it's apparent that many cities did in fact survive into this period unscathed, unknown, but they did survive. So before really discussing the post-Assyrian presence from the countryside, however, a summary of evidence from the once prominent cities is probably in order. Evidence for occupation / reoccupation of the capital cities in and around the Assyrian heartland comes mainly in the form of so-called squatters settlements at Nineveh, Nimrud, and Khorsabad. So Nineveh's sacking, of course, was by far the most impactful of the Median and Babylonian incursions. It's what functionally ended the empire. The archaeological evidence from Nineveh, somewhat appropriately, is primarily from the destruction itself, however, rather than material from the period that directly followed. However, post-Assyrian occupation has been uncovered at various places within the lower city and also at the Nabu Temple and the Southwest Palace on the Kyunjik Mound and an area KG just east of Kyunjik here that I've indicated. At Nimrud, also known as ancient Kalhu, the post-Assyrian occupation of the site was largely confined to the citadel and the arsenal. And you can see that I have the arsenal highlighted here and the citadel here. Where the collapsed brick and destruction debris from both the 1614 and the 1612 sackings was leveled off and reoccupied. Beyond some burials dug into the walls of the Adad Nerari III palace, settlement in Nimrud is largely seen in the reuse and the partial reconstruction of buildings in the Azida, the Burnt Palace, and the AB Palace. Large rooms from these Neo-Assyrian buildings were subdivided with mud brick walls, similar to what was seen in parts of Nineveh, while floors were once again paved over and sometimes repeatedly paved over. Resettlement likely occurred quickly after the city's destruction by those that had been displaced during the military incursions. Reoccupation tends to be in the most defensible areas of Nimrud, and this might betray some kind of security concern with regarding outside dangers that people might have been facing in the post-Assyrian period. Considering there's evidence for violent destruction of several post-Assyrian levels in the Ekal Masharti, and the effort to rebuild the arsenal's north gate seems to be in defense, the theory does seem borne out. So after the destruction of these apparently short-lived settlements within Nimrud, though, further evidence of the post-Assyrian period is scanty. Like at Nineveh here, the only real evidence of continuity at Nimrud is seen in the reconstruction and the reoccupation of the large palaces. However, reoccupation does appear to be almost completely domestic in nature, rather than anything related to administration or continuance of the city's economy at any level. So moving on to Khorsabad, further north at the very edge, and in some cases just beyond the heartland, which was ancient Dur-Sharukin. This exhibits much of the same type of sparse settlement after the Median incursion. The secondary occupation on the citadel, post-dating destruction levels, almost certainly belongs to the post-Assyrian period. This consists of reusing the architecture in a way similar to that seen at both Nimrud and Nineveh, with partition walls of mud brick and paved flooring above destruction layers, which is present in Sargon's palace, in Palace F, in residences K and Z, the Sin Temple, and the Nabu Temple. The exact dating at reoccupations at Khorsabad is elusive, to say the least. It's unknown how much of the city was also reoccupied after imperial collapse. However, the data from the reoccupation levels within the royal and religious buildings on the citadel, with that we can observe that all of these structures post-collapse, all of the use of them tended to also be domestic in nature and held apparently no relation to their original functions. So we're seeing overall a pattern of apparent total break with prior imperial institutions in the post-Assyrian period. However, this alters slightly when we talk about Ashur, which is the southernmost mega center that we're going to be discussing in this talk. So like Nimrud, it did also suffer two violent incursions in 614 and again in 612. Ashur exhibits a slight difference in post-destruction occupation than the other Assyrian capitals. While domestic structures were constructed / reconstructed across much of the city, accompanied by a number of post-Assyrian graves, perhaps the most notable example of reoccupation is that within the Ashur temple itself in the northeastern section of the city that you can see here. So two small structures identified as shrines were excavated in the forecourt of the temple. These appear to be constructed in a way which parallels Babylonian architecture at this time, and as such may date to Babylonian control over the city during this post-Assyrian period. Babylonian control is certainly more well attested at Ashur than at the other Assyrian capitals. It was one of the cities that cult statues were returned to after Cyrus's invasion of Babylon. A Babylonian governor was also likely present at Ashur, according to a tablet from Siphar's archives referring to him. So beyond the temple of Ashur's shrines, the other palaces and temples of the city apparently remained in roughly a state of disrepair. Our main archaeological evidence for institutional continuity then comes from the shrines themselves in the Ashur temple. If these were indeed constructed on the Babylonian model, then there really does appear to be a persistence in structure use, in this case religious, maintained by Babylonian official presence at the city, possibly to purposefully draw upon local memory or local strains of religious practice that the people were used to in Ashur. If there was also indeed a Babylonian governor of Ashur, we can also expect somewhere to be a palace or a residence of some type to have been built or occupied, though archaeological evidence for this remains skim. So with these centers discussed, it becomes evident that the Assyrian institutions of governance were really not locally maintained at these cities in the Heartland. While areas of these cities were reoccupied following collapse, there's really no evidence for anything resembling the continuance of governmental administration, at least at the centers within the Heartland, with the possible exception of Ashur, as we just talked about. So occupation instead tended to be largely domestic in nature, often referred to as squatters' levels, like we talked about. And while the levels of some floors of palaces and temples appeared to have been maintained, it seems largely in the service of local, perhaps household-based economies and community maintenance. So with that said, and with the urban centers explored, it is now time to turn to the countryside. Recent studies of state collapse have begun to identify typically more continuity outside of main centers maintained beyond collapse events in more isolated countrysides. While political systems in main centers ceased, small-scale social structures such as household organization did really tend to persist through these events. This is seen across multiple different cases of imperial collapse. We see this in Mesoamerican households, following the collapse of the Aztec Empire, and in the social organization of Ayllus in the Nazca region of Peru, where events of collapse still saw community governments and the persistence of raised field farming, which was thought to be a state-administered practice, but was clearly also maintained beyond the collapse of the state itself. In general, small-scale communities such as these are often able to maintain their structure through societal decline, even in the face of collapse events, and in our case, violent collapse events. As such, we might expect that the Assyrian villages in the rural space, which were relatively removed from the sites targeted for attack, might maintain their organizational structure and social makeup in some form. Thus, probably our best chance of assessing the degree of continuity after Assyrian collapse may, in fact, lie in the rural marginal spaces of the imperial core. So still very much within Assyria's governing center, but less immediately subject to the violent end which characterizes the imperial collapse in the cities we just saw. So as is to be somewhat expected, post-Assyrian material outside of the main centers is an even shorter supply. The known excavated material from non-grave contexts from this period are really only from the sites that you can see here, and you'll notice that a decent amount of these are not even within the Heartland, but are relatively adjacent to it. Some of the most well-known material from the post-Assyrian period comes from the sites of Khirbet Katanuya and Khirbet Khosrij at the edges, at the very, very far edges of what can be considered the Assyrian Heartland, excavated during the Eski Mosul Dam project in the 80s as salvage excavations. So Khatuniya was inhabited in the late Assyrian period and then into the post-Assyrian period, with evidence for a break in occupation between the two. The Assyrian occupation apparently ended in a destruction event identified in the two rooms of an excavated late Assyrian building. Because of its relative proximity to Nineveh, we can assume that the site was enmeshed in much of the Assyrian administration that was in fact experienced by other smaller sites within the Assyrian heartland. This is important to consider, really, when we take into account the notable destruction of the late Assyrian occupation phase at this site. Within the excavated building, this destruction really took the form of nearly a meter of collapsed mud brick walls with multiple hole jars smashed in place on the Assyrian period floor. The exact timing of this destruction is unknown, though when Khatuniya was resettled in the post-Assyrian period, there did appear to be no attempt to recover the previous architecture at all. Instead, the new structures, which were domestic in nature, were more modest and along a totally different alignment that you can see here. With this difference in architecture and this lack of an attempt to recover prior occupation, it's likely that Khatuniya exhibited very little continuity between phases. Though no evidence for an institution as such was present at Khatuniya in the Assyrian period, the clear break between these phases is evident and speaks to general discontinuity exhibited in this area. Meanwhile, the nearby settlement of Khirbet Khosrij was also excavated as part of the salvage missions during the dam construction. It's located only 2 kilometers to the east of Khatuniya, and it's a single period site dating to the post-Assyrian period exclusively, with the excavators estimating a date in roughly the first half of the 6th century BCE. So Khosrij might have been a settlement of some notoriety, as indicated by the finds of terracotta wall nails and the site's larger size. Like Khatuniya, the walls and floors were comprised of stone, which might speak more to local availability than anything else. Excavations of the site were centered upon the industrial complex that had a large kiln for firing ceramics, which you can see here. And there's really no indication beyond this, however, that the industry was at a scale meant to provide for anything beyond the population of the settlement itself. In fact, Khosrij had a relatively short occupation, which could speak to the general insecurity of this area during this time. Since Khosrij was built on virgin soil adjacent to the other Neo-Assyrian site of Khosrij Cliff, there really appears to be no continuity between the two with the evidence acquired, though it is possible that the settlement of Khosrij Cliff could have lasted into the post-Assyrian period and those levels might have been washed away. This was observed in the publications of both sites. In either case, the excavators were able to distinguish distinctly different ceramic production styles between the periods of both that shows either some sort of social change or the cessation of Assyrian production to be replaced by ceramics of similar shape, but different production technology, potentially indicating a rise of local production strategies. So in either case, really, there does appear to be a discontinuation of any Assyrian institutions in this area. So this is not a whole lot of evidence. Luckily, we are beginning to add to this small pool of evidence with the preliminary results from our relatively new archaeological project on the Erbil Plain in Iraqi Kurdistan, part of the Rural Landscapes of Iron Age Imperial Mesopotamia project, or since that's a mouthful, we call it ARLIM. The site of Khatresh, which is located 15 kilometers south of Erbil, provides us with an opportunity to examine these developments during the late stage of the Assyrian Empire and then the centuries afterwards, as we're finding. Material found at the site covers the height of the Assyrian Empire and its subsequent collapse, including periods on the Erbil Plain, which might have been under Babylonian control in the 6th century, and then Achaemenid control following. Excavations and remote sensing at Khatresh conducted between 2021 and 2023 as part of the project have shown the site's importance as a rural center, likely for the storage or production of agricultural products and animal goods. Rural settlements, such as Khatresh, represent a kind of critical nexus of interaction between imperial bodies and the landscapes that they inhabit. While known initially that the site had at least one large administrative building from magnetometry investigations conducted by myself in 2021, The results of further remote sensing and excavations have shown that the site contains at least several of these large structures, if not more. So in building A, that you can see here, at least 13 small rooms surround a large central courtyard. So building A is this right here. A similar set of at least 5 small rooms adjacent to one another was identified roughly 100 meters to the northwest of building A right here, designated as building B. Though the rest of the structure isn't visible in the magnetometry results, the small rooms preserved from both buildings A and B likely served the same functions during Assyrian rule, administration, and storage. This theory is further supported so far with the recent expansion of magnetic radiometry to the south from this last season, revealing a large complex consisting of at least 12 rooms in a roughly rectilinear arrangement, with additional anthropogenic features present around them, what we're calling building C, that you can see here. So also interesting to our investigations into the nature of this site is the presence of at least 2 of these features, measuring roughly 120 by 50 meters, this one here in yellow, and 60 by 30 meters just here, just north of building C and south of building A. We've preliminarily identified these magnetic features as large animal pens where iron-rich dung accumulates along the fence line of such pens and creates a higher magnetic signature than the surrounding soil matrix. Between building C and feature 1, additionally, there is a possible gate or entrance between these 2, measuring roughly 5 meters wide. This is evidently associated with these features. So building C is evidently built at the same time as these pens, or the pens might have been built right on the heels of building C's erection, which might, if they are animal pens, mean that they might have been used for staging animals during counting, during possibly taxation seasons, or for butchery. So while surface collections of Khotresh had originally identified the site as Neo-Assyrian, excavations revealed a more complicated history to the site overall. Our excavations began in 2022, focused on these structures, and we started with building A and building B. Our excavations in building A targeted its northwest corner, exposing at least 2 potential storage rooms and part of the courtyard. The construction of the building is notable with mud brick walls over 2.5 meters thick that you can see an example of here. In building B, likewise, the rooms were enclosed by monumental walls of the same size and of the same brick type. While we've only excavated a test trench in building C so far, the mud brick construction seems very similar to the other 2 buildings, while the exact alignment between all 3 buildings confirms their construction in consideration of each other, if not at the exact same time. So the overall establishment of Khotresh in the Neo-Assyrian period was confirmed with ceramic analysis of materials from building A, which further narrowed the period of site foundation to the era of the Sargonid kings in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. So what then does this transition between the late Assyrian and the post-Assyrian periods look like at this rural site embedded within the Heartland itself? Do we see evidence possibly for continuation of imperial administration practices at Khotresh, or do they go by the wayside? They definitely go by the wayside. What we find instead is a distinct break in the use pattern of the site itself. So within building A's courtyard area, roughly 0.5 meter above the original floor level, we found traces of a later occupation consisting of a hearth or fire installation accompanied by ceramic and faunal debris. Buildings B and C likewise survived in some regard into the post-Assyrian period, though evidently abandoned at the same time as building A. While we've not uncovered evidence of later occupations and domestic occupations in either, we have identified multiple strata of dumping debris within the rooms of building B, including ashy layers, ceramics, animal bones, and various artifacts, leading to the higher magnetic signature that is apparent in the magnetometry data. The nature of the ceramic assemblage is largely consistent with storage functions and domestic use so far from what we found. The rooms making up building C likewise appear similarly in the magnetometry data, indicating that they probably contain the same types of dumping debris as building B. We ended up confirming this by the test trench from this last season, where ceramic analysis conducted by Dr. Kyra Kirker has been able to confirm that the ceramic assemblages from these dumping strata of both B and C do date, in fact, at a post-Assyrian period. While more fine-tuned dating really escapes us at the moment, this is all preliminary, we are once again beset by the continuity of ceramic forms throughout the 6th and 4th centuries BCE. What we can derive from this is a certainty that at Katresh, Assyrian administration practices really fell out of use after the collapse of the Assyrian Empire. We don't know exactly when this happened. So at Katresh, the walls of building B remain preserved up to an estimated height of 2 meters, while in building C, we have at least so far an estimated 1.5 meters preserved. In both cases, the dumping strata nearly reached the full height of the preserved walls, indicating to us that the use of these buildings as dumps began before any real disintegration of the buildings could take place. So the decay / collapse of mud brick structures in arid climates has been observed to take anywhere between 20 to 100 years, depending on environmental factors. Thus, we can tentatively propose that the reuse of these buildings took place likely within a century and possibly within mere decades after the collapse of the empire. Likewise, the later occupation of building A that I pointed out is difficult to date, but the ceramic forms from it fall more in the range of late Assyrian types than post-Assyrian types, and therefore may have been established immediately or close on the heels of collapse. What we see from the combined centers of these urban and heartland, or urban and rural spaces in the heartland really point to a breakdown and discontinuity of Assyrian governmental systems in this area. However, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have evidence, both historical and archaeological, that tells us this was not necessarily the case in other areas of the empire. Sites in the area of the Khabur River Valley, which you can see circled here, which was controlled by Assyria, though was spatially separate from the heartland, seem to exhibit a degree of institutional continuity that the heartland just did not. Persistence of Assyrian systems can really be seen here in northern Syria by the continuity of institutions inferred through the continued use of the terms Pihatu and Shakanaku in officials. The Khabur region specifically is also referred to in the Babar archive in Sippar in year 24 of Nebuchadnezzar's reign as a source for sheep offered to Shamash, and followed in later years with references to cattle, grain, and vineyards from the same area that were supplying parts of Babylon and especially their temples. So undoubtedly, our best archaeological evidence for this period in the area comes from the site of Tel Sheikh Hamad, like I've mentioned, ancient Durkat Limu, on the Khabur River. It was once a main administrative center within Assyria also. Thorough excavations of the site by the Freie Universität in Berlin uncovered a structure known as the Red House that you can see fully exposed here. The house measures nearly 6,000 meters squared, and it's estimated to have been occupied in the 630s by an elite family whose head was a contemporary of Ashurbanipal. Occupation at the Red House continued pretty much uninterrupted through the Assyrian imperial collapse, providing some of our best philological and archaeological data for this transition that we otherwise don't have from other places. After the original head of household died, his sons appeared to take over the family's business and holdings, and documented transactions really continue uninterrupted through the tumultuous years of 614 to 608 BCE. For notable documents, post-dating Assyria's fall utilized the year formula of Nebuchadnezzar himself, illustrating an apparently smooth transition into the new rulership. So further examples of institutional continuity in this area can really be seen at other sites such as Tel Halaf or ancient Guzana. Area C at Tel Halaf especially maintains evidence of continuity in the Neo-Babylonian period, where phase C6 concerns the last occupation phase of the Neo-Assyrian governors, one of the last occupation phases of the Neo-Assyrian governor's palace, which was estimated to have been constructed in the early first millennium BCE and continued to be used in the Neo-Babylonian period. And really a few changes were made to it between the two. Likewise, at Tel Bari, ancient Kahat, this Assyrian institutions appear maintained through the Neo-Babylonian period, mostly from the evidence in Area J, or Bari's royal palace, which was utilized in the Neo-Assyrian period and continued to be in use following the collapse of the empire. The palace itself actually underwent restoration in the Neo-Babylonian period to bring it up to speed, so to say. Additionally, it seems that Assyrian administration practices were continued under Neo-Babylonian rulership, with Neo-Babylonian seals uncovered within the palace during this next phase of occupation. And finally, as just another example of institutional continuity, we have the site of Haran in southern Turkey, which provides perhaps our best historical evidence for some form of continuity by the Neo-Babylonians. As the last holdout of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, it was specifically targeted in 609 BCE by the Babylonian army to put down the remaining vestiges of Assyrian power in the form of the last king or crown prince, depending on who you talk to, Ashur-uballit II. Several stelae from Haran have been discovered, the most famous of which recounts Nabonidus' order by the god Sin to rebuild his temple at Haran, the Ehulhul. So you can see here, I am Nabonidus. Sin called me to the kingship. In the night he caused me to behold a dream, saying thus, Ehulhul, the temple of Sin, which is in Haran, build it quickly. Though the restored temple has not been excavated due to its likely positioning underneath a more modern mosque, the philological evidence really here is more than enough to prove institutional continuity at Haran, perhaps more so than at any other site we've yet discussed. Because of this, Haran is considered by some to be one of the most consistent loci of Babylonian rule. So, all in all, there is clearly some difference between continuity in the Heartland versus continuity outside of it. This exploration has been kept, of course, necessarily simplistic by the dearth of evidence that has been frustrating to those who study these empires for decades, centuries, take your pick. With such a lack of data, we can also be asking, at this point, why does this matter at all to inquire about? And to that, I would say that this line of inquiry, in this case, looking at the staying power of these state institutions, is less about the institutions themselves and instead informs us on just how impactful Assyrian governance was on its subjects. How embedded then were these systems within communities, the economy, and the landscape during the height of the empire? When we instead think of it from within this framework, the continuance of Assyrian systems in the Khabur versus their relative disappearance in the Heartland becomes even more striking. The imperial Heartland apparently underwent a much more extreme event of collapse via Median and Babylonian military incursions, which apparently affected the countryside as well as Assyria's larger cities. Furthermore, an important aspect of the Heartland, which we can't really ignore in a discussion on the impacts of collapse, is the makeup of its population and the embeddedness of these Assyrian systems in the lives of its people and the environment of its landscape. A consistent part of collapse is a shift to a dispersed pattern of smaller settlements with an abandonment or depopulation of larger cities. While post-Assyrian sites, are notoriously difficult, of course, to identify from surface ceramic scatters alone and are certainly under-identified in the record, the sometimes total abandonment of the large centers proven from historical records and excavations certainly altered the settlement landscape of the imperial core. It's well known from Assyrian sources that tens of thousands and sometimes even estimated at millions of people from across the empire were deported and resettled in the imperial Heartland, with the lion's share of these resettlements occurring under the Sargonid kings. If many villages in the Heartland itself were populated by these deportee groups, within just a short century prior to the collapse of the empire, there's a good chance that many in this situation would simply just depart once the state keeping them there had dissolved. So for the conclusions of this talk, in the Heartland, even in rural spaces, there seems to have been a distinct break between the Assyrian Empire and a lapse of imperial institutions in this area. The exact reasons why, of course, are still unclear. When compared with other cases of state collapse, it's really odd that the rural side was affected so profoundly, but that's likely because the Assyrian Empire was so integrated into even the marginal spaces of the Heartland that collapse had a profound effect there too. Rural spaces, as discussed, can usually escape most of the ill effects of collapse because they are less involved and less administered by state institutions which undergo the collapse itself. The fact that in this instance we see such a break speaks to the intensity of this event throughout the Heartland and not really just in Assyria's main cities. So to kind of dig down more on these questions, literally, our continued field work as part of ARLM is really interested in exploring this more. Our first goal in continuing this will be to try to identify the residential areas where the post-Assyrian villagers of Khatresh were residing. While our remote sensing investigations have so far been really successful in identifying the large storage complexes and unexpected associated landscape features, we have less evidence for potential domestic buildings in the area. The nearest known Assyrian center to the site is that of Turpus Bian, which you can see here is located nearly 2 kilometers away under the modern town of the same name, and is therefore an unlikely candidate for the residency of those using abandoned Assyrian buildings at Khatresh as dumping grounds, which probably would have been much closer. To this end, we're expanding our remote sensing program to cover both estimated site limits based on a resurvey of Khatresh carried out by EPAS in 2021 and beyond into the surrounding landscape led by myself, with a program planning to be implemented hopefully in this next season to train local archaeologists on geophysical methods. At the same time, we're also analyzing the local continuance of agropastoral strategies at Khatresh in both the Neo-Assyrian and the post-Assyrian periods. We're doing this both through archaeobotanical sampling carried out by Doctors Elise Lagier and Lucas Proctor, and through zooarchaeological analysis conducted by Laurel Pullman. Analysis of the local Assyrian and post-Assyrian ceramic industries, of course, are being done by Dr. Kirker and will continue along with hopefully any continuation at the site in artifact style and iconography headed up by Glynis Maynard. We're hopeful that this, along with further excavation and sampling being carried out in these dumping strata that we were not expecting to come across, but are happy we have, will continue to provide much needed information on this relatively opaque transition in the countryside of the Assyrian Heartland. So with that, I also want to thank Kak Kefi Ali and Kak Nader Babakar of the Kurdistan directorates for their immense support for this project. And of course, our project representative, Ahmad Jodat, and our logistics man, everything man, Bapir Rowanduzi, without which none of this would be possible at all. So thank you very much for listening.